Hello, everyone. This is the Nuestro South podcast, Loud and Proud. Mi nombre es Axel Herrera, and I am your host. This incredible series continues to explore the Poder y Cultura of Latinx folks in the South through perspectives of amazing scholars and community members who have the lived experiences and research background on what it's like to be Latino, Latina, Latinx in the South. Our conversation today focuses on Southern Latinx stereotypes and navigating the racial landscape of the U.S. South. We have an amazing guest with Dr. Cecilia Márquez. She's an assistant professor in the history department at Duke University. Go Duke. She's in the process of completing her first book, The Strange Career of Juan Crow, and her work helps historize contemporary Latina migration to the U.S. South and emphasizes the importance of region in shaping the Latino and Latina identity. Dr. Cecilia, muchas gracias. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you.
No, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am excited about this conversation. You are based in my, I guess now as an alum alma mater, but you know, you're also in my hometown, which is Durham. So first, we want to get to know a little bit more about you, your background. So I want to first start just real quick. Where did you grow up? And if you could share kind of like what that means to you, where you grew up.
Yeah, I grew up in Northern Virginia, in Arlington, right outside of DC. And it's a contested place in the South. If you ask my family in Georgia, they would tell you definitively that it is not the South. If you ask the people I went to college with outside of Philly, they would tell you that it is. And you know, it's a complicated place. I think it's somewhere that is trying to claim that it's not the South, and yet I grew up right near Washington and Lee High School, Jefferson Davis Highway, and the burial ground of Robert E. Lee. So there's a lot of history there that is deeply Southern, and a lot about the way that that community is shaped that is deeply Southern. So I grew up in Northern Virginia. The question of region is a complicated one there, but yeah, that's where I'm from.
No, I totally feel that, because I feel like Virginia, to me, actually, when I was younger, always seemed like it was counting as part of the South, and now I feel like that transition is kind of spilling into North Carolina. But I totally get that. I totally sympathize with that. And just real quick, what about your family's heritage? Where are they from?
Yeah. My father immigrated here in the 1970s from Venezuela, and my mother is from Miami. They met in Philadelphia in graduate school. Yeah, that's where they're from.
You got a little bit of South Florida.
A little bit of South Florida, a little bit of Latin America. Yeah.
That's great. All right. So I have, now that we've kind of been introduced, I have a few other quick questions. So we're going to claim Virginia right now as part of the South. So growing up, what is either a location or Southern, either type of Southern spot, or maybe even Latino, Latinx favorite food spot in Virginia?
Oh, totally. La Union, which was the pupusa spot in Arlington, Virginia. Arlington and Northern Virginia in general, huge Salvadoran population, huge Bolivian population, but there was La Union. It was our sort of corner pupusa spot that we went to a lot.
I wonder what the name references. The Union of what?
I don't know. There was also the other place that I always sort of joke, people ask like, oh, like, did your mom cook? And I'm like, yeah, we bought really good Peruvian chicken anytime anyone comes over from Crisp and Juicy. That's the name of that sort of like Peruvian chicken place. Yeah. So most of the, so I grew up eating that because my family didn't cook. So that was that.
My mom was sometimes the opposite, right? She wouldn't want to buy food. And so my sister would ask her to go out, eat somewhere. And she's like, vamos a comer homio. It was just the worst joke ever. But she would say homio. So just go find food at home. Another one is, where did most Latinx adults you knew growing up work?
Oh, that's a really good question. I guess most of them that I knew, so my family, both my parents worked in the federal government. And so we lived in a suburb of DC, which at the time was mostly government bureaucrats. And so people who worked in the federal government, not necessarily sort of like high ranking officials, but the kind of like everyday people who work in the government. And so that's sort of most of the adults that I knew. And that included a really sizable Latin American population. And so living in the United States. So similar to my father, sort of migrants who came for graduate education and then eventually working in places like the government.
That's interesting. So it's I mean, in terms of like migration stories, right? We tend to hear kind of the migration stories of like, come as working class, come as farm workers, come as like service workers, but we're talking about a little bit more of a professional trajectory.
And I wouldn't say it's representative of when we think about who the Latinx population in Arlington, Virginia. It certainly wouldn't be representative, but that was sort of my Latinx experience.
Yeah, no, my mom just, I recently had a little bit of a thought about this because my mom recently, she has to renew her passport, and she obviously almost like always waited to the last minute. So I was trying to help her research some things, and the Honduran consulate is one of the most difficult things to get a hold of. But I was going through like one of the web pages, and it's very interesting to see they have a ton of pictures, and I was like, it's just so weird to see kind of those images of professional Hondurans. But yeah, I kind of had a little bit of those thoughts in my head recently as well. So hey, it's still part of that story, right? So I get it.
Yeah, and I mean, Arlington is also home to a lot of people who, this is true in my book as well, historically, who work at the embassies in DC. So it's home to both an elite Latin American population who are coming to work in the embassies, but also a working class Latin American population who also come to work in the embassies, but instead as nannies, as people cleaning the embassies, tutors, things like that.
Yeah. All right. And last quick question, still kind of about yourself, about home. I guess I'm going to almost assume now you may be more suburban, but how would you describe your where you grew up? Urban, rural, suburban? And I guess now that you're in the South a little bit more, or you have family, which one do you prefer?
Full-blown suburbs, no doubt. I moved from New York City to Durham when I came here, and I swore I would never live in a subdivision. I was like, that's not my life. Like, I'm not going to be suburban again. I'm living in a subdivision. And I like it. I like suburban life in a way that I don't know, that I didn't expect of myself.
Yeah. Where were you in New York?
I was living in the Village. So I was working as an assistant professor at New York University. And so I was in Lower Manhattan, right by Washington Square Park. So like the busiest part of Manhattan in the world. And I grew up outside of DC, and I think I thought of myself as someone who was, urban, if not urban adjacent.
Yeah.
And I was wrong. And so when I got to New York, I was like, I am a suburban kid.
I can't do this.
I did not know what I signed up for. Like, it's a really different level of urbanness. So so I lived there and then moved here a couple of years ago.
Okay, well, a little belated, but welcome. Glad to have you here. As a transition to the conversation of what this entire podcast is gonna like focus on, which was a bit of work, I would like to start that by asking first, why the interest in the South, I guess, academically or professionally? Because eventually, I guess that's what brings you to this place. So how did you come about to kind of start working on some of these themes or focusing on the region of the South as part of your work?
Yeah, so I came to it through the civil rights movement. So when I was an undergrad, I attended the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's 50th anniversary conference, actually not that far away from here in Raleigh at Shaw University. And I was really interested in SNCC. And while I was there, I met a man who, Luis Zapata, who was involved in the United Farm Workers and then later involved in SNCC. And so I became interested in how Latinos were involved in the Southern Civil Rights Movement. And that's what I was planning to go study when I went to UVA. And when I got there, I spent a lot of time sort of researching the history of Latinos in the Southern Civil Rights Movement. And pretty quickly, I realized there was a story that was bigger than just Latinos coming South for this activism, that there were Latinos who were there in the South living in communities prior to the arrival of these activists. And so what started as a project about Latinos in Southern civil rights organizing became this much bigger story about Latinos and race making in the US South.
I feel like it's one of those things that until someone starts, I guess, vocalizing it and displaying it, you're like, that probably made sense. But otherwise, I mean, like most migration histories or narratives, if the voices aren't given a space to exist, to be heard, they're invisible, right? So, I mean, for folks that I've had some conversations now with a few of in our interviews, and like when they talk about their families, when they talk about the histories, they're not, you know, in the last 10, 20 years. They go 30, 40 years, multiple generations. So I totally get that. All right. Awesome. So we start with kind of this focus on civil rights, and then you start uncovering a bit of this history that exists, and then this bigger story and narrative. So can you introduce us a little bit to how you go from civil rights and what you find next in terms of like Latinos in the South, or their involvement with, you know, the racial and economic layout of what the South was?
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone who's been in graduate school or anyone who's had to write a senior thesis or any kind of project probably knows it's a lot more wandering than we'd like to admit. You know, it's a lot of kind of discovery and surprise and, oh, I didn't expect it to be about that. So I started looking with the civil rights movement, and then I became interested in, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about this later, in south of the border, this Mexican themed rest stop at the border between North and South Carolina. So that was the next kind of chapter that came to fruition. I was trying to understand the history of this place, and this place that seemed sort of modern in some ways, in the way that the South thinks about Latinos, but in fact has a much longer history. And then, I mean, and this is sort of the happenstance of it all. A friend of mine gave me a news clipping that he found about this Mexican-American woman being kicked out of an all-Black vocational school in DC in the 1940s. And so from there, I started researching DC and this kind of ambassadorial and professional class in DC of Latinos and Latin Americans, and their experience in DC and how they navigated Jim Crow in the 1940s. Because DC, well, again, we might think of it as this kind of borderland between the North and the South, was certainly very Southern in the way that it organized race and the sort of commitment to Jim Crow. And so from there, I mean, I at that point was spending a lot of time with family in Georgia, in the Gwinnett, Beaufort area, and was kind of watching firsthand the change unfold in that area. And so I became interested in Georgia, and was sort of focused on Dalton, Georgia for a little while, and the carpet manufacturing there and the history of that. And then it also became more broad and became about labor migrations in general to Georgia, and the kind of labor narratives that emerged at that time. So trying to think about how Latinos were first racialized in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s as hardworking immigrants.
Yeah.
And how that eventually turns against Latinos after 9/11 and after the Great Recession to become illegal aliens. And so then the last chapter is part of what we were thinking about in our conversation today, is about this rise of draconian anti-immigration legislation that some activists have called Juan Crow legislation. And so it's looking at that and why it emerges at that particular moment, and how Latinos are navigating life under these under this legislative regime that's designed to make life unlivable. And
there's so much to that, right? I think you're not only highlighting that there's different periods of time, right? Right, if we're talking about, you know, 50, 60 years ago, there's one iteration of the South that we're dealing with, and then a set of policies or stereotypes that are like Latinos, how Latinos are racialized or perceived. And then I think for a lot of, especially the folks that may be listening to this, who are kind of around my age range, what we know and what we see is the past 10, 15 years, right? I've been in North Carolina for about 16. now, and that's my reality of what the South is, right? And it seems like it's always been like that, but it's not necessary. So I want to start with somewhat grounding our conversation with this topic of Jim Crow and Juan Crow.
Yeah.
And I would love if you kind of would give just this is a super difficult question, but just a small outline of how you define Jim Crow in your work, or what you're referencing to help folks understand how we go from that and why Juan Crow is something that is used.
So Jim Crow, I think of as a political, cultural, social, juridical regime that sought to create separate lives, or at least a fantasy of separate lives for Black and white people, that focused on creating whiteness through the oppression and management of Black communities, Black labor. I think about, I mean, there's just so many things to say about what Jim Crow was, and I feel like I want to reference like 14 books here, including, sure. I mean, I think what comes to mind for me is Blair Kelly's Right to Ride, a book about segregation in Richmond. There's, segregation and train travel, I should say. So I think about it as a regime that's sort of designed to define whiteness against Blackness, and to sort of manage labor, manage hierarchy and things like that. So Juan Crow is sort of different in that, I mean, if you think about Jim Crow, that's a sort of an explicitly racial regime of laws. It says, that we can separate these spaces because of the race of the people within them. Whereas Juan Crow is using sort of more colorblind language, that it's about illegals, in scare quotes for those listening. It's about illegals, it's about undocumented people, but it's not necessarily about race in as explicit a way as a system like Jim Crow would be. So that's the big difference between them. I mean, that's one of the many big differences between them. And the Juan Crow term really emerges in a few different times. So we see it first in Arizona after the passage of SB 1070, which was the sort of popularly known as the Show Me Your Papers law.
Yeah.
And then SB 1070 passes, and then very quickly after that, Southern states start to create their own copycat bills that are more draconian, that are harsher. And those laws also get called Juan Crow by journalists. So I'm thinking of Roberto Lobato. I'm thinking of activists who held signs up that say "Stop Juan Crow," and talking about Alabama's legislation, Mississippi's legislation, Georgia's legislation. And I think the goal behind using Juan Crow is to reference this long Southern history of separate and unequal forms of governance and forms of social life. And so I think the goal is to really mobilize sort of a cross-racial community in support of, or interracial community in support of abolishing this legislation.
Yeah, that's actually, I'm not sure if I had heard it prior to reading a little bit about what you were discussing in your writings. But I think loosely, at least when I heard it, having grown up here, at least when I heard it, it was like, oh, I can see that. That was my initial reaction to the term Juan Crow. And I can see, I guess, how either activists, journalists, how it's like a catchy like parallel to draw. But I've had a few conversations with not only with my family, with older generations of immigrants about race and racism in the South. And I think to understand that context, it's a long journey, it's a long process, right? Even for someone who's bilingual, educated, whatever, like me. But then I've also had some conversations with other scholars here that talked about kind of labor work and organizing, where they worked with, it was in Mississippi chicken plant workers. They worked to kind of have this like whole curriculum that would identify and just trace not only race and labor issues within their own context, right, in Mississippi, but then also have kind of this global mindset of like, okay, how does race and racism operate in Latin America, and
Right.
and you know, introduces themes of Afro Latinos and all that. So I guess based on those examples of just how difficult that work was from what the scholars and the process that even within my own family or my own personal self, understanding racism or understanding the South, I'm curious how the folks using this term, how easily they thought the line could be drawn, or how easily they thought like the folks they were organizing like, for example, immigrants, thought the immigrants themselves would understand what this means, right? How aware were they of like the original Jim Crow that they were
Yeah.
alluding to?
I mean, I think it depends. I think that there's so many different kinds of Southern Latinx organizing efforts that are happening simultaneously at this moment. I think about the not exclusively Latino, but heavily Latino Freedom University that was happening in Georgia. I mean, and that is something that is so directly referencing the citizenship schools and freedom schools of the civil rights era. That's somewhere that they created this very explicit curriculum around sort of understanding Southern history, but also, as you mentioned, understanding the kind of geopolitical history of like, why are Latinos here in the South today, right? Like, why did we all end up here? And what are the push and pull factors that resulted in that? So I think that it depends, is sort of that the answer to that. But I think that part of what it's trying to do is speak in part to legislators and speak in part to a kind of a national audience that understands the history of the South as one that is perpetually about the civil rights movement and perpetually about Jim Crow. And we can critique that, right? I think that the ways that the South has been sort of I don't know, frozen in time in certain parts of the American imaginary, as on that bridge in Selma, or all these different sort of like civil rights moments. I think that there's a way that has become frozen in our collective imagination. And so I think Juan Crow is really trying to reference that, this idea that, you know, collectively today, we might think, okay, we know that Jim Crow was bad. We know that the civil rights movement was good. So Juan Crow must be bad. And we must, you know, like, we want to be on the right side of this history. Now, of course, if you go back in time and look at how people thought about Martin Luther King and how people thought about civil rights activists, it was not as kind of cheery as we tell. And when we tell this, you know, this history in our classrooms, there was a lot of pushback from white liberals. But I think that's what it's trying to do. I think it's trying to evoke something that will shame Southern legislators into seeing the connections between those things, and perhaps ceding some ground as a result.
Yeah, and I think that's why, I guess, especially with certain populations, at least I have somewhat of an awareness, like when you hear it and then you kind of understand, I guess, the play on with the language that's happening, there's like, oh, I guess that's what they mean. So it's an interesting strategy. Like you said, I want to ask about some of the limitations to it, but before that, I would like for you to kind of provide some examples. You mentioned a few like the states starting to enact these immigrant bills and stuff. Can you describe a little bit more of like, I guess, when activists or journalists are referencing Juan Crow, like what are some of these laws that they're referencing, and what is some of these places or states or legislatures that are passing these more draconian laws?
Yeah. So, I mean, the ones that come to mind immediately are Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, which happened in pretty quick succession.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, North Carolina and several other places have their own 287G agreements and things like that are particularly hostile to immigrants and Latinos in general in the state. But the goal of these, the sort of wave of legislation, was to basically make life impossible for immigrants in their state. So it put the onus on schools to verify that the children attending their schools were legal. It put the onus on hospitals to check that people who were coming to the emergency room were legal. It said that it made it a crime to assist anyone who was undocumented. It made it a crime to hire anyone who was undocumented. I mean, the goal was really to make it just absolutely impossible to be an immigrant in the state. And so, this has a couple of effects. A lot of people leave. Some people leave Alabama, some people leave Georgia. But the other effect is that it makes those people who do decide to stay even more vulnerable than they already were. So this is already a population that is incredibly vulnerable to all sorts of labor exploitation, and it becomes just that much more vulnerable, because I think part of the goal of the legislation is to perform this kind of America First xenophobia. I think the other goal of this legislation is to create an even more controllable workforce. And I think that's effectively what happens. And so when I interviewed students in Alabama who were talking about what happens after the legislation, they talked about family members who were working, painting houses, for example, who were not paid for work that they did, because part of what the law does in Alabama is it says contracts made with undocumented people are now null and void. So people who would clean homes and then not be paid. So we're talking about wage theft. We're talking about all sorts of labor exploitation, and just theft, just straight up theft that was happening for these communities because they had become so vulnerable under this legislation.
It's through you describing some of these specifics of how populations or communities are impacted and denied or neglected rights that kind of it clicks, and you hear, yeah, I can see why there's this kind of parallel drawn to Jim Crow. And when I was reading it, I think that was one of the first things I identified that came to mind. I was like, in terms of Jim Crow, it was this like institutionalized, legal in whatever term that is.
Yeah. It was legal, right? And that's important, because this is also legal, right? I mean,
exactly.
They've changed the language, but it's important to say, like, Jim Crow is the rule of the land. They weren't doing anything outside of the law. And similarly here, when we have stories of, Alabama water, the waterworks company denying people water services because they're undocumented, like, that's legal. That's a legal thing to do. And so what is legal is sort of I don't know, not that helpful in terms of what we think might be.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and I guess that's where, in terms of, and I want to ask about this first, in terms of Jim Crow being a hyper-racialized kind of institution. Juan Crow, maybe not necessarily in that level where it doesn't apply in terms of the racial dynamics, but in terms of like the institution of these like discriminatory like laws for immigrants who basically, if you're an undocumented immigrant, most of your life is defined by the access or lack of access that you have due to your status. I definitely can see how that relates.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also, this legislation is, again, ostensibly colorblind, right? Like, it says it's colorblind, but the reality is like the SB 1070 law in Arizona, part of the reason it was called the Show Me Your Papers law is that what that law said, and it's sort of copied in the southern states, is that law enforcement is allowed to stop anyone who is suspected or appears to be illegal, right? So someone who looks illegal. And of course, like the immediate question I hope we are asking is, what does it mean to look illegal? Does it mean to look, and of course, if you're, Irish in Boston, like, you look like a lot of, there's a huge Irish Polish population in Boston who are undocumented. Like, those are people who look illegal, right? But of course, they know what they mean, right? They're talking about Latinos, they're talking about Asians as well, increasingly. And they're talking about West Indian and African immigrants too, right? So those are the people who are being caught in these immigration dragnets and things like that. But it's basically a legislative okay to racially profile.
Yeah. And then another quick point on this, because I want to talk about, about the limitations of Juan Crow. But one of the quickest now, right, there is a huge demographic shift in the South in various communities for various reasons. And that's a whole other topic. But when Arizona passes this law, I guess being in the Southwest, proximity to the border, etc., I guess I can see that. It can make sense. But given that in some of these states, specifically probably like Alabama, Mississippi, the populations aren't like the Latinx or immigrant populations aren't like Georgia's or aren't like North Carolina's in the way that they've grown. I kept asking myself, how many people, or like how visible or how big could these populations of immigrants possibly be for them to like have this huge lashing out against and start enacting all these laws? So like why like that visceral, urgent, whatever reaction to immigrants if it's like states that are heavily pretty much still black and white?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple things. There's interesting data that suggests like some of the most xenophobic ideologies are held by those who live nowhere near immigrants, right? That it's like you live in a community with like no Asian Americans, and you have strong feelings about like Chinese taking over, right? So it's not necessarily proximity that produces the xenophobia or the anti-immigrant sentiment. In fact, I think it's likely the opposite, and that in fact those with contact instead of like day-to-day contact may not hold those ideologies quite as deeply. I think that the demographics of the South are changing fairly quickly. I think that it is, when we think about the sort of shift, you're right that it's still like largely black and white, but I think that when we think about how quickly things changed, I think that matters a great deal. I think that it's not just Latino migrants that we're talking about. So when we talk about the change in the South, I tell the story sometimes. I was at my cousins for my family in Georgia for Thanksgiving, and we made the insane decision to try and go for Black Friday to the Mall of Georgia, which if anyone here knows the Mall of Georgia, it is the last place you want to be. But when I went there with them, and we were, fighting off people to get Old Navy sales, it's super migrant. And it's not just Latino migrants, right? We're talking about Asian Americans, West Indian, African migrants. And so Georgia is I think just shifting in a lot of ways, and the South in general. So I think that part of it is just the big change that people are seeing. I think the other thing that's happening, and this is kind of at a sort of at a bigger level, 9/11 sparked incredible xenophobia and incredible nativism, and produced a surveillance apparatus, right? It made certain kinds of surveillance and policing legal that weren't before. And then after 2000, and so this happens in 2001 at the same time that we're seeing this growth in immigrants in the South. And then in 2008, the Great Recession happens. And it's 2 or 3 years later that we start to see these laws show up. And anyone who knows Latino history, recessions aren't good for Latinos, not good for immigrants. Historically speaking, Latinos are hardworking, they're family people up until there's an economic decline. And then we become drains on welfare, we become illegals, we become all, so the economic, health of the country says a lot about how Latinos are doing in the national discourse. And the Great Recession was yet another example of that. So when the economy collapses, the same Latinos that were sort of heralded in some communities as hard workers, as lifebloods of different industries, all of a sudden become illegal, they become dangerous, they become criminal. And so some of that is sort of bigger economic shifts that are happening in this time that have very little to do with demographics, but have more to do with a kind of national shift in the way that that some people were talking and thinking about immigrants.
For the younger audience who are these 1.5 second generation immigrants, that context is important, right? Because our consciousness into like society, how our families, our communities are being racialized or criminalized, were happening at a much younger age. And now looking back at it, we basically need to understand those dynamics and to understand why we end up with either some of these laws in our own states, in our home cities, to then like think of strategies. How do we move forward? How do we kind of like fight back against some of them? So now moving on, let's chat real quick about these limitations of the kind of Juan Crow term, and what are some of the lives or stories that are left out when you try to kind of redefine things as Juan Crow now?
Yeah. So I think one of the challenges that I saw, and this was coming more from the press than it was from activists themselves, in the discussion of this legislation, was a focus on Juan Crow as the new Jim Crow, right? Like the idea that Juan Crow was this kind of new manifestation of a long forgotten system. And so there's a couple problems that I see with that. One is that the lingering effects of Jim Crow are still very much with us. In the South, in the country, the inequality that was perpetuated in this time period. And if you want to read more about it, I think Ta-Nehisi Coates' Case for Reparation, Nathan Connolly's A World More Concrete, both sort of lay out beautifully the economic devastation that was wrought by Jim Crow in this time period. That those are still with us. And so this idea that Juan Crow is replacing a system that still lingers in the lives of so many is it's sort of challenging for me, and something I want to be critical of. I think the other problem, and this is something I think we have to think more critically about across kind of Latino activism in general, and I've seen some really exciting moves in this in younger generation, like sort of current activists. So I don't want to sort of knock people who are doing, I think, a dope job at this right now, but is the way that Juan Crow also configures the sort of victims of this legislation as exclusively Latino and exclusively a mestizo or brown Latino population. And so this is problematic for me, at least for a few reasons. The first is that it erases the Afro-Latinx populations that exist throughout the South. We can think about the growing Dominican population in Atlanta, the Afro-Mexican population in Winston-Salem, not that far from here in Durham, that Afro-Latinx people have been in the South also just as long as non-Afro-Latinx people. So we can think about the Afro-Cubans and Afro-Puerto Ricans who were attending Tuskegee back in the early 1900s, and Arturo Schomburg, who attended Fisk. I mean, these are like famous Black Puerto Rican, Black Cuban thought leaders who are sort of forming some of their ideas here in the US South. And so the problem with Juan Crow, and I think in general, some of the Latinx activism of the early 2000s, was the way that it configured Latino as an identity that was exclusive of Blackness. And especially in somewhere like the US South, where so much of our racial order is defined in relation to Blackness, right? Which is how close or far are you from the category of Blackness? The erasure of the Afro-Latinx population is incredibly damaging and incredibly anti-Black, right? And you talked a little bit about how we are still having to reckon with the realities of how race functions in Latin America, right? Like that's part of that like a lot of Latinos are also coming to the United States as white, as Indigenous, as Black, and with all of the kinds of hierarchies that come within those categories. And so the anti-Blackness that is sort of happening here in the South is also being bolstered and supported by the anti-Blackness in Latin America, right? They're feeding each other and they're learning from each other. And so I think what I wanted to think about was how could we think about a activism that understood the way that Black immigrants were disproportionately actually affected by these kinds of policing. Because when we think about a growth in everyday stop and frisk type policing in the South, Black people are going to be disproportionately affected. So we're talking about Dominican and Jamaican and West Indian immigrants who were also deported under this legislation. And we can look to the undocu Black activists to learn more about that. That what it means to think about centering Blackness in the story of Latinos and how that reshapes our ideas about race and activism and what justice looks like.
What I like about what you said is that there's one thing to bring up the stories and histories of Afro-Latinos as a way to complicate what you said, like what the journalist is saying, or as a way to complicate what the academic is saying about the region. But it's probably even more interesting to use it as a way to complicate what we ourselves as a community, how we're seeing our own movement, right? For other generations, if we're coming from like a town, a city, an aldea, whatever from a Latin American country, I guess we're just kind of like leaving it there. Whatever existed, whatever dynamics, racial dynamics exist there, they just either come with us or they stay over there, and that's it, right? And then we get dropped into the South, and you start trying to navigate whatever exists in that context. But for younger generations, in terms of how I interact with race, the first times that I start recognizing it is like when I'm seeing it in like the classroom as the one kid that's like in the middle of things. But unlike others, my history from my hometown in Honduras is one that includes the Garifunas from my town. So northern Honduras, most of the northern coast has African diaspora of Garifunas. And so, and my immediate family is, like you mentioned, mestizo. The nickname for me was Gringo come galleta de chocolate. So it was gringo. And apparently I liked to eat chocolate cookies. Closer cousins were, I guess, most mestizo in more of a mulatto way, or had more of like kind of like the African heritage or ancestry, and my mom's uncles as well, just because they were, step siblings. And so for me, coming into seeing race in the South, I was seeing it as like in the classroom, like, hey, this is this person, this is that, like black, white binary. But in the household, it was like my two uncles who are racialized more as black here in the United States are in New York now. So like they like blend into those communities in some ways with Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. But me in the South, I guess I had a blackness of what the South was defining it, but there was also like a different way. It was just like, it just existed as home. And it took a while for me to kind of recognize that those are probably different ways that I was seeing race. And yeah, so I think the more interesting part is like the self-awareness or consciousness that this is part of, I guess, general Latinidad is a very interesting and important conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is a conversation that we need to be having, that is happening and is being led by Black Latinos and Indigenous Latinos, not just in the South, but across the sort of the globe. Right, that we have to reckon with the way that even the category of Latino in a lot of ways is about the denial of Indigenous and Black ancestry, right? That it's trying to create this kind of, it's kind of aligned at times in this project of mestizaje and this kind of, we're a magical mixed race, la raza cósmica, that we're this, that category itself is actually incredibly complicated and fraught and has value, right? Like I'm out here teaching Latinx history. That's like what goes on my paycheck in part. So like I have appreciation for it, and also an understanding about the way that is an exclusionary category for a lot of people who, if we think about Garifunas, for example, like if we think about, well, are those people seeing themselves reflected in sort of contemporary Latinx politics? Why is it that some Hondurans arrive in the United States and see themselves reflected in Latinx politics, and other Hondurans would not? And so I think the reality, people always want to talk about how race is different in Latin America, and certainly that is probably true. And at the same time, like when we look at the kind of hierarchies and how life chances play out, the reality is that Black people in Latin America and the United States face harder life chances than people who are lighter. That's just what it is. And so whether or not there's the history of Jim Crow in Latin America, the consequences are fairly similar.
One of the biggest ways that I've had to interact with this, which is so weird, there's two ways. One is kind of recognizing the language and rhetoric that came towards me or my siblings or even my mom as a kid, right? In terms of this this kind of general positiveness of us as children, and why we were like in Spanish, and still like I grapple with the terms, right? It's like, oh, que lindo, que bonito, que esto, que lo otro, like the way that we were kind of like viewed in terms of just the positiveness. Now I'm always questioning it, like, but what value judgment are you making, right?
Yeah.
And then especially like when we were kids, because we were so different compared to the general community. And then now I always try to think of the rhetoric that may be used towards my uncles in terms of like, hey, they're unemployed currently, they're struggling to pay this. And then within the own family, there's this rhetoric of like, they're not doing this, they're not trying, they're not working hard. And then, you know, the dissonance is weird, because then like, hey, I had 4 years to read, study, and do things in college. But after taking that time, I'm like, out of that, I'm thinking, all right, what are the dynamics of not only being undocumented, but also of race that are operating to make them and their like labor just super vulnerable. And so the conversation of me thinking about them and trying to work through what they're experiencing or facing is totally different than that which my aunts or other family members are having, because they haven't grappled with, I guess, race in that way.
Or I mean, you know, they may not have come to like a critical lens that you have, but
Exactly.
certainly we've all been taught our lessons about what race is. You know what I mean? I just sort of like, I'm aware of the way that we all know a lot about race, and even if, and we may not come to kind of like a progressive take on it, but that we all have lots and lots of knowledge about it. And I think, you know, one thing that was sort of resonating with me was thinking about how migration changes racial identification. And I thought sort of similarly about my father, who, you know, when I was in college, I was going through a kind of like renaissance of racial identity, and was identifying very strongly as Latina, involved in a lot of organizing. He felt very complicated about that. He sort of felt like I should be just embracing the kind of assimilation opportunities that were available to me. He identified very strongly as white. And despite the fact that he experienced discrimination in a lot of different ways. And I think what has been interesting is I think thanks in a lot of ways to Black and Indigenous Latinos who have pushed me and the community around that, is the way that I've come to understand myself and his experience differently, right? That I think the category of Latinx is in no way mutually exclusive with white. It's not mutually exclusive with Black, and it's not mutually exclusive with mestizo. And so you can be Latino and also benefit from all of the realities of whiteness and what whiteness offers you. And that you don't have to, that those aren't mutually exclusive. And I think that's really important for our community to own and name, and sort of those of us who are, to sort of name the whiteness that is part of our identity, and not obscure the very different experiences that Latinos who are darker, who are Black, who are Indigenous have, as compared to those of us who are white, right?
And there's so much more to that, but I think that those questions that you were asking, or you know, encouraging folks to start looking into, are important. Now transnationally, in terms of like dealing with race, and like there's the language barrier of having immigrants and working class general immigrants being able to like sympathize and understand the history of struggle within the South of Black struggle. There's a lot more to that as well, in terms of like, when you think about what would it look like to do coalition, but then like, you can't just do coalition automatically if there's so many layers of that you need to work through.
Yeah, and I think every country has its own particular history, but if we just take Mexico as an example, right? I mean, that's a country where they're just counting Afro-Mexicans for the first time on the census, right? There's this massive denial of the presence of African descended people in Mexico, despite the fact that they are a sizable portion of the population. And that commitment to the denial of the existence, the complete invisibilization, makes it so that you can participate in systems of anti-Blackness while not actually sort of having to account for that for yourself, right? So this idea that Latinos would come to the United States, and non-Black Latinos might want to come to the United States and create coalition with Black people in the South. There are Black people in Mexico, and were they creating coalition with them there, right? But it is to say also that that is partly a sort of an individual complicitness with anti-Blackness, but also a state one, right? That this denial of the African ancestry in all of Latin America, but I mean, perhaps especially in this case in Mexico, fuels that inability to see the ways that our identities are sort of like fundamentally forged on anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity.
So much.
Yeah.
Those are important things. And
now we can talk about south of the border.
Yeah, no. As an immigrant that came at a young age, one of my hopes is that soon I will get the opportunity to kind of go back and place myself once again physically in the spaces of either hometown or where I grew up those first few years, to just take it in.
I would just add, if you are deciding to go back to Honduras and you want to learn more, Janelle Martinez writes an amazing blog called Anti-Latina, where she writes a lot about being Garifuna. Paul Lopez Oro, who's at Smith College, writes also about Garifuna identity in New York City. And I think they're both doing really interesting work around that to help us think about what it means to be Black and Indigenous and in Latin America. So wanted to shout that out.
Amazing. Yeah, we'll definitely shout that out and maybe share some of those names and context. Moving on to something that you alluded to earlier in the conversation about what attracted you to doing some of this work, centered on the South. We're going to talk about south of the border. So if someone's driven through 95 going south, or you'll know what I'm talking about. I won't make judgments right now, but so I want you to first, but that's the way you probably get introduced to it, by actually physically driving through 95, because you can't get away from it. So how about you help introduce us, what is this place called south of the border, which initially I thought was like the literal border.
Yeah, well, I mean, so it's an interesting history. So first of all, I would say all of your judgments are fine, and they should sit. Like, feel free to have them. And anyone who's listening, like, you also have your judgments, and those are legitimate. So south of the border starts in 1949, and it is started by Alan Schaefer, who is a Jewish man living in Hamer, South Carolina, whose family is part of a beer distribution company, the Schaefer Distribution Company. And it is referencing south of the North Carolina border. So part of what happens around 1949 is that several counties in North Carolina go dry. So they outlaw alcohol. So it's saying we're south of the border as a way to indicate this is a place that you can get alcohol. So it starts that way. So it's originally south of the North Carolina border. And it's a few years later that he adds a diner, and then eventually it takes on this Mexican theme. So its origin stories are in sort of getting access to booze, and it really continues from there. I mean, the kind of underlying logic of the place is this is a kind of fun, exotic place that you can go and participate in things that you might not do in religiously conservative North and South Carolina in the 1950s.
So that's the context.
That's the context. And then there's a giant statue of Pedro, which is the reality.
So if someone's driving down 95 from, let's say they're coming from Virginia, right? They're going through Virginia, they're going to go to Georgia, which seems like a trip you made. Probably prefer to fly, but let's say they drive. What is it that they're encountering as they pass that lets them know that this is south of the border?
Yeah, so the other important context is that it starts in 1949, which is right when the highway system is starting to exist in the US. And it's when cars in the post-World War II moment are becoming a thing that more and more people own. So the trip a lot of people are taking is from the Northeast to Florida. And so that's what the 95 corridor is doing during that time. So when you're I think it's about 100 miles in either direction of south of the border, north or south, you start to see these billboards. And they're all billboards designed by Alan Schaefer's established billboard company, advertising company. So they're his own and his family's own creation.
My whole question is like, who owns these?
They're his advertising company. I mean, it's really interesting. And they're, I mean, you can think of at this time, they sort of look like a mix of like Speedy Gonzalez and like, I don't know, a cartoon hate crime. I mean, it's awful. It's like, so it's like Pedro, you know, you might read something like Pedro says, and it's like Pedro S-E-Z. So this is where we get to talk about the Mexi speak. It's all in his kind of fantasy of what a broken English accent might sound like. So Pedro says, like, stop it south of the border. Pedro says, I don't know, there's one that's like, this gets back to the kind of like exotic desire part of it, but there's one where there's a giant firework and it says Pedro's fireworks does yours, and it like looks like a, you know, a sort of a giant phallus. And so this idea that it's this place where you can have this kind of like raunchy humor is part of what's happening there. So you see those all, you know, every mile basically. And part of the logic that Schaefer talks about is that he wanted it to be a place that kids in the car driving would basically every mile say, Mom and Dad, we're stopping at south of the border. Now, of course, he didn't think about like, you know, you or me or the like many Latinos who would eventually live in North Carolina as those kids, right? But he was sort of imagining it as this like family friendly place that kids would want to stop. So the Pedro image is this cartoon, you know, again, it sort of looks like if Speedy Gonzalez was a person, right? So it's this darkened skin, sombrero, mustache, cartoon character of what Schaefer imagined a Mexican to be. And those exist both in sort of gigantic form, which is when you're driving by, you know, it's this several stories high image of Pedro, but also throughout the rest stop. There's different Pedros, little statues everywhere. And Pedro becomes the mascot and the icon and the kind of tour guide of south of the border for visitors.
That's a great introduction. I guess to mention some of my judgment, my first interaction with some of this place, I think I remember earlier as a kid hearing the term like south of the border as like a place. But really it was when during a few drives, probably to Florida as well, a few years back, a few times that I drove past it, and those billboards are one of the most obnoxious things ever because they just don't stop for miles. Despise them. Anyways, moving on.
They're very disgusting. Yeah.
I just couldn't understand like why no one could pay more to put something else other than that on, or how they could afford to keep so many billboards up. Anyways, it's much harder to understand it without some of the history that you're mentioning, right? There's alcohol involved, there's this consumption, there's this actual specific context of like, and also how it's still standing. Like when you talk about it starting in like 49 or through the 50s, I'm like, that's 70 years. That's insane.
And now it's, I mean, so for a while it was really that kind of I-95 corridor, the idea being people coming from the Northeast to Florida. And now it's mostly a more local populations, people going to Myrtle and things like that. So, you know, if you go in the winter, it looks like a ghost town. And if you go in the summer, it's like very much happening. And for a while it had a kind of like hipster chic to it. You would see like south of the border bumper stickers on people's cars. But yeah, I mean, how it's still standing remains a bit of a mystery to me as well.
Where's the revenue coming from?
Well, I think it's coming from a lot of, you know, local people. It's also, I mean, the reality too is it's still south of the North Carolina border. And so the other that is important sort of politically, I guess, that's also where you could go buy fireworks. So a lot of people's early memories of south of the border is just going to buy fireworks. Yeah.
Just a simple other example of kind of this South North Carolina point is that if you're ever in like kind of the southern part of Charlotte, just to kind of show the differences, you cross down to South Carolina to get gas because almost for sure it's going to be 20 to 30 cents cheaper than like if you're, which is like, it's a funny dynamic, but I can totally see, especially the fireworks things, people just do that, go there just to get that. Okay, but in terms of the time period that you focus on, you mentioned it briefly in terms of like what this region or area was as in terms of conservative, but could you describe a little bit more of what it was like, and I guess what was the context that this man Schaefer was building within, and what was he trying to provide to those folks or the tourists going through?
Right. So I think there's two levels. At the national level, we're seeing a growing interest in Mexico and Latin America as a sort of a tourist destination, basically because cars were becoming more ubiquitous, air travel was becoming cheaper. So more and more people are actually traveling to those places, and it's this sort of fantasy land place that people can go. We're also seeing things like Speedy Gonzalez, other images in television and movies and music of this kind of similar character to Pedro. So that's happening at the national level. That we're starting to see some of these in early culture, these ideas about Latinos that are particularly pernicious and bad starting to circulate. At the local level, there's a lot going on. So in the 50s and 60s, we're starting to see a growing civil rights movement happening in North and South Carolina. We're seeing a lot of pushback on that by white North and South Carolinians. There's a large Lumbee population, indigenous population in Robeson, who are also sort of in their own kinds of struggles for civil rights at this moment. So there's a lot happening around south of the border at this moment that is sort of deeply political. And we can see this most clearly, I think, in 1961, which is at the centennial of the Civil War. And so part of what happens during the centennial in the South, especially, is that's where we start to get all these Confederate monuments and memorials that we have still today that we think of as something that happened in 1860, but actually happened in 1960. And so one of the interesting things that happens at south of the border is that he creates Confederate Land. And so that is an extension of the south of the border theme park that maintains the Mexican theme, but also sort of layers on top of it a Confederate theme. And so Pedro's in a Confederate uniform, Alan Schaefer's in a Confederate uniform. And this is in 1961. And we can think about that as the moment when the sit-in movement is starting to really percolate around the Carolinas and throughout the Southeast. So, it's a very political decision to say, I'm going to create Confederate land and commit myself deeply to this idea of the lost cause, and saying like, the Confederacy is something honorable to remember at the exact moment that Black Southerners are very actively fighting against this legal regime of Jim Crow and for sort of broader claims around justice. So Pedro's in a Confederate uniform, Alan Schaefer's in a Confederate uniform. I mean, it's just an incredibly white supremacist space at a lot of levels, right? So both around their imagination about Latinos, but also the way they're imagining Latinos in the South, which I think is important, right? That they're seeing Latinos through this lens of caricature and comedy, and at the same time, part of a kind of imagined Southern collectiveness that is participating in anti-Blackness, right? Anti-Blackness as part of the lost cause.
I had a question specifically, this kind of image or identity of Latinos that south of the border was portraying. I guess I was so confused as to how it was an attraction and how it was something people wanted to engage with, because of my view with like the dynamics of Latinx folks or immigrants in the South today. But then I thought a little bit about more, and I was like, the way that, so you mentioned you have this term of like playing race, right? In some of your writing, and you define it a bit, and you give examples of how folks were doing it, right? Wearing the sarapes, wearing the sombreros, trying to also have this like Mexi speak, which is the broken English way that the character Pedro has in all the billboards or other stuff. At first I'm like, why would they, and who wouldn't? But then I think of like white Southern folks going to Mexican restaurants, which they tend to love. And I'm like, how can, especially nowadays, how can they reconcile, one, being anti-immigrant or not, or not, being progressive towards immigrants and others, while also kind of like just playing race, having the sombreros, singing the song, talking the way. I'm like, the nonchalant way that they just like brush that off as like, oh, this is just for fun, kind of helps me rationalize like, yes, I could see folks doing this and partaking this as just something that, you know, is just for fun. We just like to do it. There's nothing to it. There's no harm done.
I mean, you could even, I mean, this is a sort of a bit of a stretch, but you can even think about today, like how, you know, people are going to Puerto Rico, going to Mexico in the middle of a global pandemic, and people are asking, please don't come here. Please don't come be tourists here. We are trying to manage this COVID outbreak. And people still see this as a place where you know, it's different there. Like it's a place we can kind of let our hair down. We can engage, we can drink, we can be in the sun, we can have this kind of fun time. That it's a place where you go to relax and engage in leisure, not a place that people actually live, right? Not a place that people actually have lives and communities and, you know, and work and all of these different things. And so, I mean, I think a couple things. I think part of the reason that image works is that image is really, the image of Pedro is fairly, maybe not Pedro himself, but it's that idea, that sort of representation of Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and Latinos more broadly is fairly common at this point. So there's a character, Jose Jimenez, who it's also, it's a sort of like a brown face minstrel thing that happens in mainstream television, where he uses the Mexi speak. He's wearing dark skin. It's also a Jewish actor, and he gets invited to John F. Kennedy's inaugural ball, right? Like this is very mainstream practice to perform Mexicanness, to play Mexican in these really public ways. And so what's happening at south of the border is slightly different because of the regional context and what's happening in the South. But these images are really commonplace at the time. I mean, this idea, again, sort of going back to Speedy Gonzalez and thinking about others, this idea of Mexicans as clownish, as goofy, as this kind of caricature is pretty common.
And that's relevant, right? That's relevant history, because to many young folks, immigrants have always been like just this bad criminal thing, or Latino immigrants. But you can see that there's different ways that they've been defined. And then it just starts showing you that you referenced one of our actual previous guests in your writing of Perla. She talks about, you know, place making race and how that operates. And specifically where south of the border is, that is super significant because, you know, from the period where it starts to what it is now, the demographics has changed dramatically. But that's kind of one of the OG like ways that folks were making this kind of concept of identity of Latinos, immigrants, or just brown folk in general. So I wanted to ask, you referenced a little bit about this, but how is south of the border, or how they're racializing Latinos or Mexicans, more of a Southern construct than something that was happening in the Southwest?
Yeah, so I mean, you can see, for example, on those, the billboards, right? The never-ending billboards that you talked about. They talk about Pedro selling Rebel fried chicken, referencing the Confederacy. He says, you know, he uses like y'all when he in a lot of the advertisements, like he uses Southern phrases and sort of turns of phrase. So it's interesting because Pedro's someone who has both what Schaefer imagines to be a Mexican accent and a Southern accent at the same time, which is also, as a side note, a thing a lot of people have now.
Yeah, it actually exists now.
Totally. Like, I mean, when I talk to folks when I was talking to young people in Alabama, like that's, you know, like we're talking about like Spanglish with an Alabama accent, you know, like that's like a thing that exists now. It's like barely normal. But so you know, and going back to the point about Confederate land, it wasn't just about, you know, oh, these are, you know, images of Pedro that look exactly the same as what we might find in the Southwest. They were really inserting him into a Southern history and a Southern context by putting him in this Confederate cause and in a Confederate uniform, and really mobilizing and putting in and making Pedro part of this white supremacist project of anti-Blackness and anti-civil rights movement and all of these different things. I mean, it's deeply anti-Latinx, and they managed to use him to be deeply anti-Black, right? And so it's sort of like, you can do two things at once, as we all know. You know, white supremacy has no limits in its capacity for creativity. And so they're using him both as a way to play with race and imagine themselves in a kind of fantasy leisure space of Latinos, which is what they imagine, and using him to perpetuate anti-Blackness and lost cause fantasies that serve to dismantle or undermine civil rights activism in that moment.
It's one place, one location that honestly, if you look deep into it, which kind of is what you have done with some of your writing, which I encourage folks to look into. There's so much to unpack within it. Or just take the drive, take the drive through the billboards, and then you give over.
And then call me, because I want someone to write an maybe I'm gonna have to do it, but I want someone to write an ethnography of how Latinos in North and South Carolina today are interacting with that space. Like, what are people thinking about it? I'm a historian. I'm like I can tell you what like people in the 50s thought about it.
Yeah.
Like, what are people thinking about it today? Like, I'm so curious.
I don't know. I'll have to grapple with like whether or not I like actually stop one day or not. We'll see if I have.
You can stop without buying something, which is what I've done. So
okay, that's I mean, that's probably I probably couldn't bring myself to buy anything, but anyways, to wrap up some of this conversation, which brings together a little bit of the conversation of Juan Crow and then south of the border, I wanted to ask how do views of Latinx immigrants, Latinx folks in general, go from exotic and tropical with south of the border to more of this Juan Crow anti-immigrant nativism?
Yeah.
Like what, how does one see both of those come up into itself?
I mean, first of all, I think what's amazing about, again, sort of going back to the way white supremacy works, is the way those two things can actually coexist a lot of the time. And I think that there's parts of the way we imagine Latinos contemporarily that still perpetuate that idea of Latinos as exotic and tropical, and also dangerous and foreign, right? This idea that those things can actually live together. So part of what I'm arguing in the book is that it's really not until the 80s and 90s that we're starting to see Latinos in the South, like actual Latino bodies, because importantly, south of the border is not a story about Latinos, right? It's a story about white imaginations of Latinos. It's not really until the 80s and 90s that Latinos are starting to be racialized in a kind of consistent way throughout the South. And that's when we see the rise of the kind of like Hispanic, hardworking, family-oriented, good Christian immigrant. And that's not universal. Julie Wise writes about places where that did not work out the same way, but in a lot of places, that's what's happening in the 1990s. And then we talked a little bit about this, but it's not until the early 2000s, or the 2001, 2008, 2010, that we start to see this shift, where Latinos become sort of feared and reviled as these dangerous forces, right? And so part of what's happening in the 80s and 90s is sort of obvious, right? It's Latinos are showing up for the first time in really big numbers, and they're just changing the way race is operating in the South. And the other thing that's happening is also that the Sun Belt is, as a kind of unit, so if we think of that as somewhere that goes from like the Carolinas all the way to California, this kind of Sun Belt of the United States is becoming increasingly integrated. And so the South, while never, a kind of hermetically sealed, never, a boundaried real place, it's always somewhere that we imagine, it's not a real place. But it increasingly becomes part of a broader region. And therefore, some of these ideas that are much longer standing in California and Arizona and New Mexico make their way into the South. So the South, where there hadn't been a kind of consistent anti-Latino sentiment prior to the 1980s, we start to see some of that moving east, right? And some of that is the kind of, the coalescence of the Sun Belt. Some of that is the rise of the sort of like proliferation of television and radio, and the kind of growing national culture that it comes up when we have sort of new technology. But yeah, so there's a growing sense of Latinos as a kind of racial group in this time period. So that's really when the shift starts to happen. But I would say, again, these things change based on the economy. Things change based on this particular place that you are in the world, in the South, in the moment. And they're very rarely super consistent.
And that is the importance of really this work we're trying to do, because it wasn't 10 years ago, it wasn't 20 years ago that this history of Latinos and how they're perceived, how they navigate this landscape of the South starts, but it's decades ago, right? And that's really where this project started. And specifically, it matters in terms of region, it matters in terms of state, it matters in terms of rural, urban, or what national narratives are happening. So that's great input to be getting. I want to ask you this question because I think it's relevant to a lot of the audience and folks who can't understand what we're saying, since we've had this whole conversation in English. How do these younger generations navigate, who are U.S. Southern, but also Latinx? How do you see them navigating these racial dynamics, racial mores of the South today, as either immigrants themselves or children of immigrants that have grown up in this space?
Yeah, I think you're much more qualified than I am to answer this. I am a historian. I will say that I think that the distinction of being a kind of Latinx Southerner, I don't, there's some collapsing that happens of this idea of, the folks I talked to in Alabama, for example, right? They're born and raised in Alabama. There's nothing contradictory in their mind about being Latinx and from Alabama. They're like, I grew up in a Latinx community. I'm from Alabama. What's the problem? So it just doesn't, it doesn't.
Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's enough to say, right?
Right. There's no contradiction for them. But I think that's important, because some of the way this has been phrased, or has been framed, I should say, is this idea of Latinos as newcomers, as sort of foreign arrivals in the South. And some of that is true, but for a lot of people, that isn't true anymore. And I think what's happening is we're having to redefine what Southern culture is. And I think Latinos are part of that.
All right. And to close our conversation, I have two questions that I've asked most of the other guests, with a slight change up depending on what our topic is. The first one, I would love for you to answer based on a little bit of your work, or maybe an extension to what you just shared. How is, broadly speaking, Southern Latinx cultura or identity being defined today, if it's no longer just south of the border?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer. I think you all are doing it. I think that this podcast and these, the kinds of conversations that you all are having, are trying to get at the multiplicity of ways that you can be Latino in the South. And I think that there's not necessarily a kind of unified Latinx cultura identity in this moment. And that's kind of what's really exciting, right? That we have Dominican culture in Atlanta that looks really different than Guatemalan culture in Atlanta, which looks different than Salvadoran community here in Durham, right? And I think that that's really cool. I think there's the same way there's lots of Souths, there's lots of Latino Souths. And so I think, I guess I don't want to overdetermine it, because I think it's still evolving in ways that I'm sort of like, it's exciting to watch. And I think you all are part of that, this effort you all are doing.
Yeah, no, I will echo that, because one of my experiences just with this project has been trying to perceive or share in what Latinx and Southern can mean beyond my Southern context, right? Which is a very specific one. It's in North Carolina. It's based on like the small town to urban communities that I've lived in. But listening to someone who came to Georgia in the 90s is very different. Listening to someone who went to Arkansas is different. But there's some of those trends and overlaps that are just great ways to connect. But the differences are also just as amazing to learn about. And lastly, you kind of shared a little bit about this, but I would love for you to share something that for you currently represents this concept that we're trying to expand of Nuestro South.
I guess, this is where my head's at today, because I'm deep in teaching right now, but I think about my students a lot. So I'm teaching at Duke University. And I think it's been really exciting to see and I'm teaching a class on Latinx social movements that is, majority Latinx students, and just seeing the way Latinx students from North Carolina, from the South, and from across the country are rethinking categories like Latinx, like the South, the way they're in the process of rewriting these categories that, you know, some of us are trying to think about, feels really exciting to me. And so I think some of the dynamism of like young Latinx Southerners who are sort of like working through these questions like you all, it's just, that to me is like really exciting to see what the next kind of iteration of this is going to be.
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, that's something that I've personally been thinking. My young years have been defined by trying to push back in terms of a lot of things that have been labeled onto us. And I'm at this point where I'm starting to think like 10, 20 years from now, I think it'll be a very different way that I feel about being from this place. I don't know what that will be like, but I know it will be different for various factors. So that's a great way to put it. The students and the youth and what we say and how we define things is essentially what's happening, right? So I want to thank you so much. We had a blast in this conversation. Dr. Cecilia Marquez, we appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.